Hey, it's John at Tinderbox Arts. This is a 2013 Triumph Tiger 800 XC. It's my son's bike. He'll be doing the work in this video, and I'm just going to commentate and run the camera. You can see we already have the front end off the deck using a scissor jack underneath the engine there and pivoting on the center stand. And one of the first things he wants to do is just get some of the stuff off of the bike that's going to be in the way of taking the wheel off. So he's got the brake caliper here. He's going to loosen these bolts. And when he takes these off, he's going to hang it up on something. You don't want to leave the caliper hanging on the line itself, the brake line itself. So he's using a little bungee cord here to tie to the frame so the weight of the caliper is not hanging on the line. I'm just holding the wheel here steady so he can work. Now this top cap you want to loosen early on in the process. This particular one was very tight, tighter than it should have been. So now he's going to move to a socket and we'll turn the steering all the way so it locks and he can put some pressure on it. Yeah, that's tighter than it should have been. We'll do the other side too. All right, with those top caps just loose, then he can move on to removing the wheel. So there's two locking bolts here he's going to loosen. And I reminded him that he forgot the wheel sensor. You want to get that out of the way and be very careful about this. You don't want to bend anything here. So he'll hang that out of the way. And then he can loosen the axle nut. And now he can drop the wheel totally down. And he's removed the axle there. I'll just take that wheel from him, get it out of the way. All right, now there's a saddle that connects both of the forks. And it's not complicated, but there's some bolts here. And he's being very careful here, you see. That's because they're kind of messed up from the road. There's road salt and dirt and stuff in there. So he's just being careful he doesn't strip them, which is wise. So there's four of those, two on each side. And then you'll see here, right here, there's that reflector, and there's a bolt in the middle of the reflector. You got to take that off. Again, the road grime has kind of seized it in place, so he's trying to be careful, not strip anything. And with that gone, and the other side gone here, then we can remove the saddle and just put that aside. There's a little connector here for the brake lines. We'll just remove that, get that out of the way. Now before we loosen the four bolts for each fork, I'm going to measure the top here just so I put these forks back where they need to be. So we got about 7 millimeters there, and we can put them back the way they came from the factory. So these four bolts get loosened up, and then each fork can come out individually. Again, he's being very cautious about not stripping these, and you want to make sure you hold the bottom so it doesn't drop out on you. All right, so with that last one loose, you can slide that carefully out so you don't scratch it. And we'll just do one at a time. Okay, we'll set this up now, and this top cap, remember, has already been loosened, so it's just a matter of removing it the rest of the way. There's an O-ring in there we want to be careful about, and there's no spring pressure on this one, so you can just loosen this by hand. And once it gets to the top here, we'll expose what's underneath. Now there's a locking nut there, which we talked about here, and he's going to grab a wrench. He's pointing to it here. He's going to grab a wrench, or I will, and then he can loosen that top cap from the locking nut. And then I'm going to measure how much thread is exposed from that locking nut so I can put it back the same way when we put it back together. So he'll loosen this cap here. And there you see where my finger is, the locking nut. And I'm just measuring how much is exposed here. So it'll be all set when we put it back together. Now there's a retaining clip here. You do not need a special tool. I just pulled down, you see that retaining clip? I just pulled down on the sleeve, and with another set of hands you can pull that retaining clip out. And then just, there's a little spring pressure there, but not much. So you can easily do that by hand. You don't need a special tool. That's what this special tool is for. All right, then we can pull this sleeve out carefully because it's got oil dripping from it. And there's that little plastic doodad on the bottom there you want to make sure you don't lose or scratch. Looks pretty good. Now we couldn't get that spring out by pulling it, so we had to dump the spring out. So, you know, you need some kind of pan here just so when the spring comes out it doesn't splash all over you. So there I am pulling the spring out carefully. You might be able to fish it out, but we just couldn't make it work. The oil doesn't look too bad. All right, so we'll just dump all that old oil out. And that's as far as we're going to take it. Here's the oil. It's an SS8 Showa, and it's actually sold by Honda as well. So if you can't find it at a Triumph dealership, you could buy it at a Honda dealership. Now I'm just going to pour this entire contents in, which I know will be too much, but I'm going to show you how we're going to handle this. So this entire container is emptied in there, and then we're going to end up taking some back out. Now before we do anything, you want to take that plunger, and I want to do this multiple times, you know, 5, 6, 10 times. You really can't do it too much. I want to make sure any air bubbles in there are out, and then even after I do this a few times, I'm going to let it sit for a while just so the air bubbles get out and doesn't screw up our measurement. Now we are going to take a physical measurement. My son was curious what it is anyway. In this particular bike, it should be 107 millimeters down from the top. Now it's actually too much. We put too much in, I know that. What I'm going to do is use this siphon. It's a special tool you can buy. And I'm going to mark 107 millimeters. And then I'm going to tighten that little knob right here. And that gives me 107 millimeters from the top. When I put this in like this, I can use this siphon and pull out the oil. When it gets to that 107 millimeter mark, it won't suck out any more oil and I'll be dead on. All right, so you see here the air bubbles coming, and that's as much as I'm going to get out. So now I know I'm at 107 millimeters from the top. And my son is just checking that. Can't hurt to double check. And we'll get a physical measurement. Then out of curiosity, we're going to put the spring back in. And I'm going to measure with the spring in, which is not the factory measurement. But we were just curious what that would be. It might come in handy in the future. So with 107 millimeters with the spring in, it's about 40 millimeters from the top. So that's just a reference in the future. Maybe you'll need it. Now we can put this sleeve back in carefully here. That goes on top of the spring. And we'll bring this up so we don't spill any oil. All right, now we got to get that retaining ring back on. Okay, so I'm going to pull down this sleeve, which compresses the spring. My son will slip that little retaining ring in there, get it seated right, and I'll let the spring pressure come back up, and we're in good shape. Remember I measured before how much thread was exposed? Well, we're going to do that again and just make sure we're basically where we need to be. This isn't super critical, but I'm just careful about it. Now we can put that cap back on. Now remember, we need a wrench to hold the locking nut. He'll start that cap by hand so we don't strip anything. That's just aluminum, so it could strip pretty easily. And with that all the way on like that, now we'll take a socket and put a little pressure on it. I couldn't find a torque value for this, so we just tightened it so it seemed pretty good. Now I'll put some oil around the O-ring so we don't damage the O-ring. We can put this back together, slide this sleeve back up, and screw that cap by hand as far as it'll go. You always want to get everything started by hand. And then once we get it just about seated, he'll take the socket. And again, we can't get the torque spec right now. We've got to wait till it's back together, but we'll get it fairly tight so no oil leaks out. Now we slide the fork back in. This is actually the second fork that we already did. And I'm sliding that back in. I'll hold that there for him. He's measuring the top, so he gets the right measurement at the top. I believe it was 7 millimeters exposed. And then he'll tighten some of those bolts just temporarily so it'll hold the fork in place. And then we'll get our torque measurement after that. All right, here he is with the torque wrench. And I put some of these specs at the end of the video. And he's going to go until he sees the right measurement there. This is an old school torque meter, but they work good, and it's a great way to learn by feel how tight something really is. Here we're tightening the top cap to the right spec. So it was 35 Newton meters for the top cap, and it was 20 Newton meters for those other bolts. Now with all those bolts, tight and to the torque spec, now we can start putting everything else back together, the saddle and the brakes and all that. Here's just some specs for you if you need them. And here my son is putting everything back together. He's got the wheel in place, put the brakes on next. And be very careful with that wheel sensor so you get the correct gap and you don't have any dirt or anything in that sensor. That's something you could easily screw up. So he'll put all that back together. And that's basically it. You could double check your measurements along the way, always a good idea. And then go for a ride.